It's a great honor to be here. Let me just give you a warning right away that this presentation may make you feel uncomfortable. The science won't, but some of the other things about the person may. So with that being said, let me just try to tell you a little bit about me for a second. I've had a long career at Intel and digital equipment and Silicon Valley startups for some 35 years. I'm basically a business technology person. And I got into this, and I'll explain a little why, just out of general curiosity. My real company is Frontline Aerospace, and we do drones, and quickly pivoted towards gas turbine efficiency, where we talk about saving 10 to 40% in fuel in gas turbines. But that's really not why I'm here. I'm here to talk to you about Joseph Papp and the mystery of the noble gas engine. I had some synchronicities that occurred, for those people that are familiar with that, back in November of 13, where I was talking to Tom Vallone on the phone. He said, what's the latest interesting over Unity thought? And he said, well, you got to look at the noble gas engine. And so I called my dad, who's in the front row, Dr. Bob Wood, and said, have you ever heard of the Papp engine? And he said, well, I was just editing a book by Tompkins, and he has a whole chapter about that. And so I said, wow, that's interesting. And then I looked up on the web and saw, wow, I found this explosion article that Richard Feynman was at. And then I found the Caltech editor who was there, and he did a project for a senior project on sunspots, and so did I. So there's all these things that happened in like 6 hours. I said, okay, that's it. I'm going to dig into this. And so I started to dig into it. So I did what I do, and that's sort of be an investigative journalist, be a patent lawyer about this, look at the technology as much as I can. And so I sort of dug in and tried to, and my conclusion is that this is a very solvable problem right now. This is the quick agenda. We'll talk about Joe Papp, sort of his chronology, some of the data sources that I use, the technical, how does it work, and what to do next. The quick overview of the Papp engine is you have, when it's expanded, this is just sort of an internal combustion engine diagram. When it's expanded, you have these noble gases and chlorine in the bottom of, and deoxygenated water, gas at the bottom, and two electrolysis pieces. Let's see if I can get the laser pointer. Well, that goes on from two electrodes. You're making a little hydrogen, and then when it compresses up, there's an electric spark that goes across and it explodes. The UV light triggers the chlorine and the hydrogen gas, and it explodes very rapidly and back and forth. And that's sort of how it works. So that's the quick overview. I'll delve more deeply into it as we go on. But anyway, a quick overview of Papp. He was born in 1933 in Hungary. He got a job at the Academy of Sciences in Hungary. He left Hungary at the revolution, went to Canada, and then went on to the US. The first problem with Papp is that he came over from Hungary and created this 300-mile-per-hour submarine, allegedly. And this is a picture of his engine power plant on the right, and he wrote a book about this. And he went from Montreal to Brest over in France in 300 miles per hour and said he did that. And he's a great draftsman. He had his skills and drew these fancy pictures of his design and built it, and there's photographs of it and so forth. But at the same time, he's sort of bipolar wacko, and he really went across the Atlantic in an airplane and hit himself in the head and was floating off a naval base when they picked him up, and he was interrogated by the French Gendarmerie, which is the FBI at the time. And he admits to doing this, but nevertheless, he really had something. And so he got a lot of baggage from that and left Canada and went to Southern California. And in October of '68, after he just finished filing all his patents, he convinced the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Pasadena at the time to take his sort of noble gas soup that he had created out to the desert and do an explosion. And we'll talk about that. And there was also an explosion at the Environetics parking lot, which I'll talk about. And then General Dynamics. did one. So this is the cannon explosion video, which you can see on the web. You know, 3-inch stainless steel, 3/8-inch diameter, about a foot of concrete all around. And they take it out to the desert and they videotape it all. And he injects about 10 cc's of gas into out of each one of these flasks into the breech. And I've got witnesses that were there and saw him do them, and every time he did it more, his hands started shaking more and more and more. This is according to Cecil Baumgartner, which I'll talk about. So this is a picture. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little syringe-like metal cylinder there pictured, so the UV light doesn't trigger the chlorine hydrogen gas that's in there. And he plugs it all in, and it goes kaboom, and it blows everything to kingdom come. And so I asked one of my Navy SEAL commander friends, you know, how much C4 does that take to blow this up? And he sort of said, well, it's really hard to estimate without, you know, details, but nevertheless, I think 0.7 pounds of C4, which is 1.4 megajoules for about 50 cc's of gas, so it's clearly something not chemical. My quick estimate was, you know, it's 10 to the 12th joules per kilogram. Oh, that's just gigantic energy. Considering, you know, and then there's either cluster impact fusion. Anybody ever heard of cluster impact fusion? Nobody. SRI, 1990. I think it went classified. But nevertheless, let me talk to you about this other explosion that was in the Environetics parking lot. This is an LA Times article. Papp had this demonstration with 70 people, including Dr. Richard Feynman of Caltech, who was there. And they set it all up, and the engine was running and so forth, and then Feynman runs over and pulls the plug out, and Papp says, well, you really shouldn't do that. The plug was for some instrumentation that was monitoring things, and then eventually Papp got more irritated and said, well, you really ought to plug that back in. And so he plugged it back in. It blows up, kills Jack Edward Hartman, who's a Mattel engineer who was also a friend of I had another friend who was a Mattel engineer who knew Jack Hartman, another synchronicity. Others were injured, and Feynman was guilty of involuntary manslaughter and settled out of court with Caltech. Jack Edward Hartman is an interesting guy. He was, I got his autopsy, and they did a, you know, radiation scan for him 2 days after his autopsy. Very unusual to have that. That was the actual device that they were using at the time. So Feynman settles out of court. He writes this article, in Skeptical Inquirer. But in general, it's his. He believes Papp was a fraud, you know, and it's just his hubris and lack of ability to just step back and continue to investigate. But nevertheless, Feynman settles out of court. Then there's a lawsuit between Papp and Roser, which is the Environetics guy. And in the legal documents, there's a carve-out in the back saying, between our agreement that this solid fuel that I invented for my submarine is not part of the agreement. And so the question is, how the heck, you know, we were talking about these noble gas soups that explode. How is he doing it with the solid fuel too? So one thought is, you know, is this solid hydrogen ionic fuel that works on? That's a possibility. And then I got involved, found the court appointed John Phillips, who was a lawyer at the time, to arbitrate these two back and forth for a couple of years. And he tried really hard to get, he thought there was something very serious and real and important in this engine demonstrations and so forth. And he tried to get these people to work together for a couple of years. And he's currently the ambassador to Italy right now. And he still believes to this day that there's something important here with this, after spending a long time talking with all the parties involved. And he confirmed many aspects of what I've read and researched all about the Joe Papp engine. I did an interview with David Ansley, who was a San Jose Mercury News reporter down the road, and he wrote a big article about the Papp engine right out the Pons-Fleischmann activity in '89. And he interviewed 4 different sources and confirmed many aspects of this situation. I interviewed Cecil Baumgartner, who's alive today, and he was a TRW employee. He confirmed that the Papp engine was running in a conference room, closed conference room, for hours on end. He was at the desert explosion. There's a long interview article with him in Infinite Energy. Bill Tompkins was another interesting fellow. He worked at TRW and managed the Papp project. Eventually, Papp had this explosion and then disappeared and went to TRW, and they set him up with a classified program. And Tompkins broke the project into two projects, one a bomb project and one an engine project. And so they married, kept working along the way. Tompkins confirmed that chlorine gas and this noble gas soup were key elements of what's going on. And then one day he came to work and everything was zeroed out of his quote, green sheets in his budget. And so he was really pissed about this, and his boss said, go talk to Cy Ramo, who's the R in TRW. And Ramo said, hey, I had to cancel it. I was asked to. I'm pissed about this too. I don't think they canceled the bomb project element of it all. I have a good friend who spent his life in the Air Force in nuclear surety and then in private industry worrying about nuclear surety. And I said, Ron, is there anything different or anything between a chemical bomb and a nuke? And he stared at me and just nodded his head. He didn't answer the question, but that's what he did. And so this is an example of something that might be in between the two. Heinz Klostermann, who's down in Mountain View, raised some money, did some work about this, and Rohner and there are RWG, and there's many other people that have done experiments and worked and raised money to try to figure out how this works. But they all fail to get a true power input-output test, which is the holy grail of everything. And until you've got that, you don't have anything. So that's been the challenge. I've looked at all sorts of other data sources, and I keep gathering more and more intelligence about what this is going on. And I've got more. I just learned yet today that my appeal to the FBI came back and said, well, yeah, we found some more information about Joseph Papp, and we'll respond to you in our appeal. So I'll wait probably another 6 months before I get back a big stack. Feynman's FBI file stops at 1960. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that's past 1960 which you can't have access to yet until I've appealed Feynman's FBI file as well. But anyway, Papp is a whack job. He's paranoid, he's a conniver, he's genius, he's a workaholic, he's basically bipolar with Munchausen syndrome. He shot himself in the shoulder one time. He doesn't believe anybody. He's secretive in many different ways. And he was so secretive and weird that he drove his wife over the edge, and his wife freaked out and basically slit his daughter's wrists and tried to commit suicide to herself. I interviewed Gary Szabo, who was there at the time, basically lived that. And Papp died in '89. Left a huge probate issues, $5 million in IRS back taxes, deceived a bunch of people, and left his family penniless. So that's the part that was probably disturbing. But nevertheless, I think he really had something. So the question is, how does this work? And so I looked at these various data sources, the patents, the interviews, everything I could find. And so what I think is this ionized noble gas soup seems to be a key component. This 27.1 megahertz RF frequency, which does enhancement of the ionization. Reversible chlorine and hydrogen reaction, which is documented in gaseous photochlorination books and other science. Sparks and magnetic fields. Sparks, we'll talk about that a little bit. Electrolysis, maybe that's a little HHO involvement. Radiation, alpha, beta, gamma, and then deoxygenated water, which he uses and mentions in the patents. So there's some interesting soup of ideas here that could be figured out, hopefully. But anyway, in essence, it's this oscillating pressure of you compress it all, and the hydrogen and the chlorine gas become very explosive when you hit them with UV light. And they come down, and then they have a very slow reaction, and they come back. And so that's very well understood and written up. There's also the dynamometer test, the only real sort of proof that Papp did anything real. You know, they had this test, 776 foot-pounds of torque, 107 horsepower, very torquey engine. Normally, you know, engines are like 1-to-1 horsepower to torque, but this is 7-to-1. Is this faked? Maybe. I don't think so. But anyway, there's some of the mixtures of the chlorine gas, and the mixtures change with time, depending upon which patent. There's 3 patents related to this. Chlorine gas and UV light explode, not just like normal combustion where things explode sort of serially. It's at the speed of light. It goes across all of the atoms and kaboom. The whole thing explodes in a very vicious manner. Gaseous Photochlorination is a great book. There's a chapter all about, shows propagation of hydrogen atoms can track, can go back and forth. So with sharply defined explosion limits, which I mentioned. And there's other articles on explosion of hydrogen and oxygen and chlorine, because you have these 2 electrodes creating some hydrogen and oxygen and the chlorine gas and then explode. The Russians did an interesting article in 1956 on the thermal reaction of chlorine and hydrogen, which is a translation. But there seems to be a lot of science around this time that Papp would have been absorbed into and sucked into. Here's a word cloud, which I can email to somebody about. You take the patent and run it through a word cloud and see all the various ideas that come up. And it talks specifically about various gases and chlorine states and so forth. There's a South African patent in 1981 which changes the noble gas mix a little bit, and each gas is ionized separately, and these added coils and magnetic fields to this. So there's a lot of different elements that need to be studied. Could this be, you know, Ken Shoulder's work, where, you know, you have this high performance spark going across at the top of when everything is compressed? Could that be an explanation as to how he's getting excess energy out of this? I also did a remote viewing with Joe McMoneagle. How many people have heard of Joe McMoneagle before? Okay, many people. So I sent him this envelope, JP 2083, which happens to be Joe Papp 2083. It's his social security number. And I said, well, you know, when's the first discovery of this? What is the secret to making the fuel? Is it in the classified world? What's the best fuel today? You know, does it tap the ZPE? How does this work? And he's still working on this, but some of the preliminary responses came back like this. He said it's a chemical concoction, hydrogenation of different molecular components in this torus coplanar. You can sort of read the rest of it. And he drew an embodiment of a gas turbine ramjet that's just normal air breathing, but at the end you inject a special additive fuel to make it go better. We're still getting more data about what's this, you know, how does it really work? And from an intuitive point of view. So what's next really is we're looking at more investigations. I keep digging in with the various science elements of what I can discover and the witnesses and people that were around and saw this. And so if I was to say, well, what should you really do next? And this is what I would do, is I'd go spend $750K to go continue doing more research and experiment design and get the people together. So it would, my estimate, a year, $750K. So the reasons that you'd want to go do this is that there's something real here. The explosions, I don't think, can be faked. There really is anomalous big energy repeated several times. There seems to be a reduction to practice with a proven dynamometer test. The proof is doable. You can recreate this or make a smaller scale and try to work through it all. I think the risk of a null result is very low because you've already seen that this can work. And then it's got, of course, civilization changing potential, which is why we're all here, and then low capital outlay, and then the return on investment is astronomical. So those are the sort of concluding remarks and pitch really for why you might want to push at this. And now, if anybody's got a $750,000 check, I'm sure you can focus on many different choices at this conference today to where you would put your money. So with that comment, let me just go right to questions. Did I make it in 20 minutes? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yes, fascinating. 750K sounds like a lot, but it's actually a very small fraction of the amount of money that's been spent, both given to Joe and the people that have followed on. I think
Yes.
it's $20 or $30 million.
Right, I think closer to $30 million is what I've heard, yeah.
Poured down this hole. You have a special insight, or
Well, the special insight is everybody's failed to do the science that this room would love to see. What we've had is experimenters and entrepreneurs and no classically trained scientists that would go plug at this and work at it in an honest way. So I guess that's the answer to my question, or your question. Did that do it for you, or? Not really. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's another question.
Thank you. Fascinating historical development, but I'm totally confused. Is it an engine? And if it's an engine, what does it do? Does it produce more energy than you put into it?
Yes, it's an engine, a fuelless engine. You feed it no fuel, you inject the gases in it, it runs perpetually and generates work.
Okay, that's what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not clear about the role of the noble gases in it. Can you say something about what they do?
That's a great question. I'm not sure of the role either, other than maybe they're ionized to different levels. I'm just speculating. I don't have an answer there, but that's what's written up in the patent. And it seems to be the other replicators have ignored the thorium 2% electrodes and the chlorine gas, and have just focused on this noble gas soup with sparks. And that's sort of how the third parties have taken this, rather than what Papp originally described in his patents.
Have you considered the possibility, given that Papp was so paranoid and secretive, that one of the reasons efforts hitherto to replicate has failed is that he didn't include all of the actual information in his patents?
Yes, I think that's accurate, but I think the first patent is the most interesting and honest. And I filed for the original patent application, and there's some interesting changes in that versus what was actually published. So divining the truth out of those patents is, I guess, a challenge, and I don't have a clean answer for you. But he wanted to protect what he had. I think so. It's honest that he would say, these are the ranges in gases that I want to use. I want to try to protect some of this. He seemed to be much more free with the mechanics of the engine rather than the secret sauce of the fuel. Lady behind you.
Is there any sense that any of this is in use with the U.S. military as a secret technology or some other group?
The only testimony that I have for that is my friend Ron, who said there's something in between chemical and nuclear, and that's not really demonstrative. But the answer should come back, and we'll keep exploring that potential. My gut says yes.
Ryan,
Yes.
You said that Papp died in 1989, I believe it was.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if in your research and digging into so many things, which I highly commend, did you check into to see after he died what became of his papers? Because if he had some secretive information that he may have kept out of the patent, as York suggested, and which he may very well have. He might have had it in his papers, which may have been able to be retrieved after he died.
Yeah, that's a great story over lunch. Yeah, the IRS came in and bonded everything in his garage or wherever he had it, and then the area was broken into later on, and there was police reports filed for this, and many people have been after that exact thing. There are many caches of original papers and documents spread around. Szabo Jr. has some, Klostermann has some, Rohner has some. It's scattered to the wind. I think the answer is it's not there. It's in his head. That's, I think, the truth. Did we use up the 5 minutes? Okay.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.